I'm Jonathan Brent. I'm Executive Director and CEO of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. As Julia said, this is our 100th year. During these 100 years, YIVO has been committed both to an idea and to a people. And we have borne that responsibility through thick and thin for all of these 100 years, through the Nazi occupation, through the catastrophe of Soviet regime, and for 80 years plus in the United States of America. It is a commitment we take seriously with all our heart. And part of that commitment is a serious, critical, thoughtful evaluation, as Max Weinreich put it in the 1950s, of the position of the Jew in the modern world. And that position of the Jew in the modern world has become very challenged in these last several years since October 7th in many, many different ways. Challenged from the extreme right, by those who think of Jews as alien to America, as alien to Europe, and those of the extreme left who, for different reasons, come to somewhat the same conclusion and have, as we all know, spurred the rise of global anti-Semitism. And with that, the drumbeat, which not everyone adheres to, but is certainly throughout social media and throughout the college campuses in the United States, that Israel has no right to exist. And it has no right to exist, not because of the difficulties, the brutalities, however you wish to characterize it, of its occupation of the West Bank, but it has no right to exist because it was illegal from the very beginning. Because it was founded by a process that has become known in the media, it has become known in scholarly disputations, in scholarly arguments, as settler colonialism. And so today, we are going to be talking with Adam Kirsch about his book on this very subject, On Settler Colonialism, which Julia mentioned earlier, which is available through the YIVO store. Why is YIVO taking on this responsibility? I think there are many aspects of that answer, but the principal one for me is that it is the crucial question of what is the place of Jews in the world today. And since Ashkenazi Jews, Jews of East European and Russian descent, are still the majority of Jews in the world today, this is a question that bears on our survival. It's important to understand that the first settlement, as Adam points out in his book, in the land of what is now Israel, was in 1882. And it was undertaken by 10 Jews, just enough to make a minyan, from Ukraine. And they came to what was then Palestine, not with the intent of exploiting natural resources, not with the intent of enslaving indigenous Palestinian Arabs, not with the intent of displacement, but as the number 10 suggests, with the intent of prayer, with the intent of sanctifying the memory of Jewish settlement there from biblical times, and to continue an unbroken history of Jewish tradition. And so I think it's important for all of us of Ashkenazi descent and those Jews who are Sephardi as well to understand this phenomenon in a correct historical perspective. It's particularly important because this has been raised again and again and again, the question of settler colonialism in the context of Hamas, and often as a way of excusing the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th of 2023. Yet this question of settler colonialism has to be decoupled from the problems of the Israeli government, however you feel about them, and the situation on the West Bank, however you feel about that. Because the motivations that provoked Hamas were very much the same motivations that provoked the war of 1948, long before the West Bank was ever an issue. And so it's important to recognize that this question of settler colonialism is independent from the question of how the Israeli government is conducting its policies toward Arabs in Israel and in the West Bank today. YIVO is a place where these questions can be asked, where this discussion can be held. A program like this it's doubtful that it could be held on any college campus in America today. It's doubtful that it could be held in most public forums today, but YIVO is a place of openness, a place where critical inquiry can be held. And so we're delighted that Adam has agreed to join us on this occasion. Adam Kirsch is the author of numerous books of poetry, prose, criticism, and scholarship. He has written on the Talmud as well as on the literary scholar Lionel Trilling. He has written for The New Yorker and Tablet, and is one of America's finest literary minds today. And I will end with a quotation from Lionel Trilling that I think well describes Adam's commitment in contemporary American intellectual discourse. In his introduction to the 1946 Partisan Reader, Trilling issued an admonition which I believe is of current value today. That, quote, "Unless we insist that politics is imagination and mind, we will learn that imagination and mind are politics and of a kind we will not like." Adam Kirsch probes the imagination of our politics and the politics of our imagination more deeply, I believe, than any writer of his generation. And I would say that it's not only important for us to continue to do so, but that this kind of probing has been more or less abandoned by much of mainstream media, which is reflected in the fact that this book on settler colonialism was not reviewed in a single mainstream major American outlet. So with that said, I want to just say that Adam will speak for about 20 minutes, then we'll have a question and answer between himself and me, and then we will open the program up for questions from the audience. Thank you very much. Adam?
Thank you, Jonathan. For that wonderful introduction, thank you for inviting me to be here. And thanks to everyone for participating. I have learned a lot from Yivo in various ways over the years. And so I'm glad to be here contributing a little bit my part to the conversations that Yivo is responsible for. So I'll start by just talking a little bit about this book that I wrote, which is a short book, as you probably saw when Jonathan held it up. It's it's not a long book, and it was written in about 6 months after the October 7th, 2023 attack. And I wanted to respond to the attack, not just to the event itself, which a lot of people have done in many ways, but to an idea that I think is linked with the way that the attack was interpreted, especially in the United States. And that's the idea of settler colonialism. And it was striking to me that right after the news of the October 7th attack came, before the Israeli retaliation, the invasion of Gaza, but sort of the very first night, you may remember that there were celebrations of it, statements of approval of it from a number of progressive groups and campus groups, student organizations. And many of those statements and things people said on social media that approved the attack used the term settler colonial and settler colonialism to justify it, to explain why it was a good thing. So one tweet from a professor that I quote in the book was to say, there are no civilians in Israel, there are only settlers, meaning that everyone in Israel is a legitimate military target because no one is really a civilian, they're all a settler. Well, what does that mean exactly to say that Israelis are settlers? When we talk about Israel and Palestine, in that debate, in that discussion, when people use the term settler, they are referring to Jews who live on the West Bank, who live on territory that is occupied and not part of Israel according to international law. Those are the settlers, and some of them are motivated by religious reasons, some are not. There are about 500,000 Jews living on the West Bank right now, and those are the settlers in this context. But the attack on October 7th did not target settlers on the West Bank. It targeted Israelis living in the south of Israel near the Gaza Strip, inside the internationally recognized borders of Israel, what are sometimes called the Green Line. And so to say that those Israelis are settlers and therefore legitimate targets for attack makes a much broader statement. It says that all Israeli Jews deserve to be attacked, deserve to be the victims of violence because Israel does not deserve to exist and those Jews have no right to be there. That they're living on occupied land. The entire state of Israel is created on occupied land, and that the only just solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is for Israel to cease to exist and for the Jews to leave or be killed. And that is the Hamas point of view. But until fairly recently, it was rare to hear that point of view spoken, at least publicly, by Americans. But that has changed, as we all know, over the last 18 months, that the attitudes, especially of young people, are very different than the attitudes of their elders. And that's true among Jews and also even more true among non-Jews. There was a poll shortly after the attack in November 2023 asking Americans, which side do you support in this war, Israel or Hamas? And all age groups said 80% supported Israel, which is about the traditional figure in these kinds of polls over past years. But among people aged 18 to 24, it was about 50-50, 50% supporting Israel, 50% Hamas. So I thought that this was an example of how an idea, settler colonialism, which starts out in academia and is not well known, I think, to a wide public, actually has a pretty important influence on the way that people are understanding Israel, the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's no longer simply an academic idea. It's really an idea with real world political implications. So what I did in this book is look at sort of the term itself, the idea of settler colonialism, where it comes from, who are some of the scholars and theorists who have written about it, what they mean by it, and what the implications of it are. And the book is not entirely about Israel. In fact, I'd say the first half or even more than half is about the United States and the history of the United States. And I think that it's important to look at that background before looking at the way it's applied in the context of Israel. So settler colonialism describes a kind of colonialism. As we all know, the history of the modern world is in part the history of European colonialism, of Europeans settling in and conquering lands across the world in North America, South America, Africa, and Asia. And after World War II, when the decolonization movement started, those empires were gradually dissolved, either because countries like England and France gave up those territories or they were driven out in a war. And at that time, when people talked about settler colonialism, they were talking about a particular kind of colony, a kind of colony where the the empire encouraged people from Europe to go and settle in a colony in order to sort of cement its power there. So it was not a settler colony. Britain ruled India for centuries, but it was never a place where lots of British people went to live. It was ruled by soldiers and merchants, but a fairly small number of them. And so in 1947, when Britain decided to give it up, those people came home, and it was not a large disruption to the British, although it certainly was to the Indians themselves. Um, a settler colony originally meant a place like Algeria. That's sort of a classic example. Algeria was a French colony in North Africa where about 15% of the population was white Europeans. And they were Europeans, French, and other Europeans who had been encouraged to move to Algeria over a period of 150 years. And some of them had long roots in the country. And in the 1950s, when the Algerians began to fight for independence, they said, these are settlers. They're a small percentage of the population, and they have all the power, all the money, all the land, and they oppress and domineer over the vast majority of people who live in Algeria, who are Arabs and Berbers. And so to fight against settler colonialism in that context was a pretty straightforward political idea. It meant you take back the power and the land from the settlers. And at the end of the war, the Algerian War of Independence, almost all of the European settlers left and went back to France. Something like 800,000 people left in the course of a year after the war ended. So when you fight settler colonialism in that context, it means you want to get rid of the settlers and take back what they have. And that was also the story in Rhodesia, where there were white British settlers and other settler colonies. In the 1990s, academics and scholars began to start thinking about settler colonialism in a different way. And I read about this in the book. There was an Australian scholar named Patrick Wolfe, who is responsible for a sentence that's quoted very often in all of this scholarly literature, which is invasion is a structure, not an event. And what that means is that when you look at the history of Australia, which is what he was originally writing about, or the history of the United States or Canada, where this idea got a lot of traction, it's not right to think of settlement or European conquest and settlement as something that happened 400 years ago or 200 years ago, and that is now over and done with. Instead, we should think about it as an ongoing structure. In other words, everything about those societies to the present day is a continuation of the original conquest. And if that original conquest was a kind of genocide of the native population, then the current societies, America, Canada, and Australia, are also complicit in genocide and in some sense continuing a genocide. And that's a very different way of thinking about what settler colonialism is, because in countries like these, you can't decolonize in the way that you could Algeria, for example. You can't say everyone in North America who is not of Native American indigenous ancestry leave and go back to the country they came from, because in the US, that's 98% of the population. Settlement started much earlier than in Africa and Asia, and it was much more complete and essentially replaced the original native population, so that you can't say, 325 million people will go back to their original homes, because for Americans, America is their home. America, they don't see it as a colony belonging to another country that they are sort of colonists from. That idea ended with the American Revolution. We see it as our country. And so when people come to America, they don't call themselves settlers, but immigrants. One of the debates in settler colonial studies, this sort of academic discipline, is that we shouldn't call ourselves immigrants, we should call ourselves settlers. And that means that everyone who comes to America, even today, is a settler who's responsible for the process of settler colonialism. And that can lead to some surprising conclusions, including the idea that descendants of African slaves are settlers, or people who came here, 5 years ago from China are settlers. Anyone who's not indigenous to North America, meaning their ancestors didn't live here before Columbus, are settler colonists. And this idea, as I talk about in the book, has a lot of implications for politics and society, and also, I think, for ethics and even religion and spirituality. A lot of what I talk about in the book is the way that this idea of settler colonialism leads people to understand what's wrong with countries like America and Australia and Canada. And it's linked, in a way, it's a very powerful explanatory device, because you can say everything that's wrong with these countries, everything that one objects to about these countries is a legacy of settler colonialism. It's linked to the fact that these are settler colonial countries. One way of interpreting that is to relate it to the environment, to say, why is it that America, tears coal and oil out of the ground and creates uh, environmental problems and uses up the Earth's natural resources? That this is an example of the same process that led to European settlement of North America in the first place. It's that there's something about settlers that is sort of insatiable and has this endless appetite. They think that they have the right to take anything they want, whether that's land or resources out of the ground, and they don't think about the consequences of their actions. And so environmental problems are actually settler colonial problems. And in a similar way, people talk about capitalism, income inequality, gender inequality, patriarchy, homophobia. There's lots of different ways that this idea can be applied in the academic literature. Even things like public health are often linked to settler colonialism, because when people look at the worst public health outcomes for Native Americans, they talk about that as a sort of continuation of colonial genocide. If you look at a college course catalog, you'll see the term settler colonialism, therefore, in a really wide variety of contexts. When I wrote this book, I talked to my editor about it, and she said that she had not heard the term settler colonialism, but all of the editorial assistants had, because they've been in college in the last 10 years. And so they know that this is a very popular term in the academic humanities. It shows up in a lot of contexts in talking about history, society, anthropology, environment, gender studies. And in all of these connections, what it is saying is we should look at today, the present reality, as a continuation, as a structure that continues the original European settlement, the original genocide of Native Americans, Native Canadians, or Aboriginal Australians. And in the way that this is discussed, I think one thing that's important to look at, or to sort of take note of, is that settler colonialism is not the language used by Native American groups themselves. It's not the language used by Native American advocacy groups, for example. I talk about this in the book. If you look at their websites and their mission statements, they talk about things like holding the U.S. Government accountable for treaties, making it obey treaties, and holding them accountable for promises made under the law. They're not saying we want to decolonize America or sort of reverse the creation of the United States. Really, this is a discourse that is among people who consider themselves settlers for the most part, not 100%, but mostly. People in the United States, and I think it may be even more popular in Canada, who are looking at their society in a critical way and saying, what is wrong with this society? It's because we settlers have inherited this legacy, and so therefore it's up to us to change not just society, but ourselves in sort of basic ways. And so I talk a bit about how there's even a kind of spiritual dimension to this that reminds me of Calvinism, where we all inherit this original sin of being a settler. It's like the Christian idea of original sin, because it's not about something that I personally did, whether I personally settled North America or or even if my ancestors did, is not the point. The point is that we all sort of inherit this original sin of settler colonialism. And so we have to show that we are aware of it and that we are sort of trying to purge ourselves of it. And that means being, more progressive or a better person or more connected to the community or more environmentally sound. And one sign that this idea is sort of becoming more influential and widespread is the way that people use the term decolonize. You might have encountered the term decolonize. It's sort of become popular to talk about a whole bunch of different things. People sometimes say decolonize your bookshelf, meaning don't just read white authors, but non-white authors as well. Sometimes people talk about decolonizing your backyard, meaning don't plant invasive species or non-native species, but sort of only things that grew in this area originally. And one, I think, probably the most common sign of it that people may have encountered is the phenomenon of land acknowledgements. Land acknowledgements are something that I think 7 years ago, no one in the United States had probably even heard of. They started in Australia and Canada, and then in a very brief period of time, just like maybe 2 years, they became de rigueur for all American universities and probably most cultural institutions like museums, theaters, concert halls. you will often see that these places have land acknowledgements, and a land acknowledgement is a statement that basically says we are occupying or we are inhabiting land that used to belong to a specific native people. This is the name of that people. We acknowledge that we are on their land. And that can be put in a more or less apologetic way. Sometimes these statements go even further and say, our presence here is illegitimate, or we're benefiting from the theft of this land. Sometimes it's more restrained and just says we sit on land that was used to be the homeland of such and such a people. But those are very common. They're very common in academia, and I think that they're increasingly common outside academia as well. I don't know if YIVA or the Center for Jewish History has one, but institutions like it usually do at this point. And someone who wrote to me about the book pointed out that having a statement like this recited at a public event, like a college commencement or a public lecture or a performance, having something like that recited is sort of like a new version of the idea that you would open an event with a prayer, which, in American history would have been a Christian prayer, an invocation. You would have a minister deliver an invocation. This is a similar kind of thing because it's really a moral statement that sets out a moral belief that the audience is expected to sort of share and adhere to. And the essence of that belief is that America is not a legitimate entity, that it exists because of crime, and that our civilization sort of needs to apologize for its existence on this territory, and that ultimately, perhaps, it will go away and the native identity of the territory is what will last. That is what was there, as these statements always say or often say, from time immemorial. And that we're sort of just like an interruption of that process. So in talking about this issue, I'm often asked, well, isn't it in fact true that that's how America was created? It was created through invasion and war and conquest and through the killing of native peoples. And yes, of course, that's absolutely true. That is something, in fact, that I think all Americans learn from an early age. We all learn about it starting in elementary school. And all you have to do is look at a map of the United States and see all of the native place names to know that there was a native civilization and languages and geographies here before Europeans arrived. So it's not a new historical idea. It's not a new argument about history. What it is a new critical theory about our society today. I say it's a critical theory in the same way that earlier critical theories were rooted in Marxist ideas or in ideas about race. It's a critical theory rooted in the idea of settlement and settler colonialism. It's saying that what's wrong with America is due to settler colonialism, and that it's sort of up to us to purge this guilty legacy, if we can, and to the extent that we can. So that's sort of the background. That's, I think, where a lot of these ideas first took root in the United States on college campuses, starting in the 1990s and then especially in the 2000s and 2010s. Then after 2023, after October 7th, it became clear, and I'd sort of been aware of this development, but I didn't really realize how common and widespread it was, that this idea of settler colonialism was also the way that a lot of people viewed Israel, the existence of Israel, that Israel is an example of settler colonialism in the same way that the United States, Canada, and Australia are examples of settler colonialism. And I think that for a lot of people, especially young people, who see settler colonialism not just as like a regional conflict in the Middle East, but they see it as the original problem with the modern world. The thing that is responsible for the problems of the modern world is settler colonialism. That's the root of injustice. It's the root of environmental problems. It's the root of social problems. And in a similar way that in earlier generations, in the 1930s or in the 1960s, young people thought that the origin of these problems was private property and that the solution was communism, or the origin was Western imperialism and the solution was sort of Maoism and third worldism. Today, I think a lot of young people think the problem with the world is settler colonialism and the solution is to get rid of settler colonialism. Well, if Israel is an example of settler colonialism and Hamas is actually engaged in a war to destroy Israel, then that means that Hamas is working for a progressive cause. It means that Hamas is on the side of justice. And so, again, in the 60s, there were a lot of college students who didn't really know much about, say, Fidel Castro's Cuba or Maoist China, and certainly wouldn't want to go there or live there, but they were excited about those places and championed them and chanted slogans for them because they thought these are the places fighting US imperialism. In a similar way, you have a lot of young people who think of themselves as progressive and would describe themselves that way, who say that they support Hamas or wave Hamas flags or Hezbollah flags, even though Hamas is, as we all know, Islamic fundamentalist movement that opposes everything progressive, everything that those progressives support, everything to do with gender or sexuality, anything. They would find themselves on the opposite side of Hamas in reality. But because Hamas is fighting settler colonialism in Israel, it becomes a progressive cause. And so in talking about these issues, you often end up, and I've seen this over the last 6 months as I've talked about this book, we're talking about, on one level, we're talking about what's going on in Israel and in Gaza right now, because I think it's obvious that the reason why a lot of young people, certainly in 2023 and to a certain extent even today in 2025, are angry and politically active about this issue is because they see the killing of Palestinians and lots and thousands of civilians in Gaza and children. And they see Israel committing these acts and they think that this is sort of an obvious injustice and needs to be protested. And I think that that is sort of where the passion comes from. And what I'm talking about in the book is not the current war, because I was writing, at the beginning and as the war was first taking shape, but about how we think about that war, how we think about what's the lens that we see it through, what's the idea that we use to interpret it. And I think that settler colonialism is an important part of that. It's the way that a lot of people interpret what's going on in Israel and Palestine. And so I talk in the second half of the book about what happens when you apply this idea of settler colonialism to Israel. What are the ways that it fits and doesn't fit, and what are some of the implications of it? So maybe I'll just talk about that for the next few minutes, and then Jonathan and I can dialogue a bit. As Jonathan mentioned, Zionist settlement in what's now the land of Israel, what's now the state of Israel, started in the 1880s. There was a few, as someone pointed out in the chat, a few smaller scale settlements in the 1870s, but really the 1880s was sort of the start of the modern Zionist movement, and it started on a very small scale. And then in the 1890s, Theodor Herzl came along and created Zionism as sort of an organization and the political movement, gave it that name, popularized that name. Zionism saw itself, and I think Israelis and most Jews today still see Israel as an example of an indigenous people returning to its homeland, returning to the land that was its land from the beginning. In the terms of settler colonialism, sort of the key opposition, the key moral categories are settler and indigenous. If you're indigenous, that means that you belong there, and if you're a settler, it means you don't belong there. It means you came and took the land from someone else. So right away, I think you encounter this problem, which is that in the academic literature of settler colonialism, it is absolutely taken for granted that Jews in Israel are settlers. In other words, they are white Europeans who came there and took the land from a non-white indigenous people who are the Palestinian Arabs. But that's, of course, not how Jews, and especially not how Zionism, sees this history at all. We see it as we are the people who lived in this land for thousands of years, were forced to leave it by a powerful empire 2,000 years ago, and always maintained a small presence in it and also a very major spiritual and historical commitment to it. And that in the 19th century, Zionism began to recreate, to return the Jews to their historic homeland. So that's already one point where settler colonialism doesn't make sense of what's going on in Israel. A second is that a settler colony has to be the colony of an empire. That's sort of central to the dynamics of what it means to be a settler colony. So the 13 colonies in the United States were colonies of Great Britain, and then they rebelled and became an independent country. French and European settlers in Algeria were part of the French Empire. The French sort of settled them there, put them there, defended them with an army, and considered, in fact, Algeria to be part of France, just another part of France. The same is true in other settler colonies. But Israel was not founded that way, as we all know. It was not founded as the colony of a European country. On the contrary, it was founded by the voluntary movement of originally quite small numbers of European Jews in defiance of empires, in defiance of the Ottoman Empire, which ruled the land of Israel up until World War I. And then after World War I, when the British conquered it, initially the British sort of encouraged Jewish settlement in the Balfour Declaration and said, we want this to be a Jewish home. But pretty quickly, after about 10 years, they realized that the Arabs living in Palestine were very opposed to Jewish immigration, and that it was not in their political interest to antagonize Arabs and Muslims in order to help Jews, because the British Empire was a worldwide empire that included lots and lots of Muslims and no Jews. So starting in the late 1920s, immigration began to become much more of a problematic issue. And then famously in 1939, right on the eve of the Holocaust, the British basically stopped allowing Jews to immigrate into Palestine. They set a limit of 10,000 immigrants a year. And so to get into Palestine, you had to be able to get one of those 10,000 visas. So in a sense, not only was Israel not started as a European colony, it was started as a form of resistance and protest against European powers, of Jews who had been abused and persecuted in Europe for centuries and generations, saying, we can't survive here anymore. We need to go someplace where we can control our own destiny, and leaving basically as persecuted refugees to go to Palestine, to the land of Israel. And then a third important point, I think, is that colonialism is traditionally thought of as a way for the colonists in the mother country to profit, to make money. They take land in order to take resources or exploit native labor. And that is also not the case with Jewish settlement in Palestine. There were no natural resources to exploit. In fact, Jews who got there were often sort of unpleasantly surprised at how difficult it was to make a living there. And part of the ideology of Zionism was about not employing native labor. So as opposed to a situation like Algeria, where you had Europeans sort of bossing and domineering over native Algerians, the Jews tried hard to only work with and employ Jewish immigrants because they wanted to build up this Jewish economy. That wasn't the whole story, but it was an important part of Zionist ideology. But I think the most important difference and the most important reason why it's a mistake to think of Israel as an example of settler colonialism is what the implications are for the future. That way of thinking about it, what are the conclusions that you come to? A settler colony, sort of by definition, does not deserve to exist. It should not exist. It's a usurpation. It's an act of conquest. And so if a settler colony can be abolished, that's what you want to do. You want to abolish it. You want to undo it. That idea applied to Algeria, to go back to that example, inspired the Arab resistance to French rule, because the FLN, the Algerian militant group, who was sort of like the equivalent of Fatah or the PLO in Israel, they said, we will engage in a guerrilla war against the French, and it doesn't matter how many people get killed, what on our side or on their side, civilians or soldiers. Eventually, what will happen is the French colonists living in Algeria will say, this is too much. We're not willing to pay the price anymore. And even more important, France will say, we're not willing to keep sending troops. We're not willing to keep sending money. This is hurting us on the international stage. And so we're just going to like cut you loose and give up. And then all of the French colonists will leave. And the FLN was right. That's exactly what happened. You could say, in fact, that the same thing happened in the American Revolution. The American Revolution was a classic anti-imperial revolution. It was a colonial resistance movement. The American patriots had a very small army. They were definitely outgunned by the British, but they said, if we can just keep fighting, eventually the British are going to say, this is not our country, this is not our home. Why are we spending all this money? Why are we wasting all these lives? We give up and we'll go back to where we came from. If you apply the same model to Israel, if you say Israel is a European settler colony, which is what I think people in this field always say, then the implication is you can use the same tactics. You can fight a terrorist war, you can kill as many people as possible, and you can take as many casualties as necessary. And eventually you will overpower the Jews and you'll say they'll give up and they'll leave. They'll say, we can't hold out here any longer. And of course, the logical flow in that is that the 7.5 million Jews living in Israel don't have anywhere else to go. They don't have a mother country. They were not founded as a colony of Britain or France, and they certainly are not that today. So if you get rid of the state of Israel, the question of what happens to those 7.5 million Jews is either they're killed, which is sometimes euphemized as pushed into the sea, which basically just means exterminated, or they're forced to flee as refugees to other countries, or whoever will be willing to take in at least some of them, or they live under Arab rule in an Arab state, which is sort of the Hamas's goal, and other Palestinian movements as well. And then they become a persecuted, disadvantaged minority. So what that means is that Israel cannot end the way settler colonial stories end. It is going to continue to fight, not like the French in Algeria or the British in India. They will fight like the Indians and the Algerians, because that is their native country. It's the only country they have. They have nowhere else to go. And I think that we've seen that in the war over the last year and a half. It's been an extremely brutal war. in response to an extremely brutal terrorist attack. None of that is historically new. If you look at anti-colonial movements in the 1950s and 60s, they frequently took exactly the same form, which was the terrorist atrocities, killing people in cafes, killing people in schools, at bus stops, and then provoking extreme retaliation from the government, killing lots and lots of people who were not themselves combatants. But in a way, the majority of Palestinian civilians, certainly in Gaza, have no where else to go. They have no way to express opposition to Hamas. They can't stop what Hamas does, and they're not allowed to leave the territory because Israel won't let them into Israel. And I think, crucially and often overlooked, Egypt won't let them into Egypt. They don't. They all of those parties would rather keep the people in Gaza in their current situation as refugees than allow them to leave and settle somewhere else. So where I come down in the end of this book is I don't purport to have a kind of solution to the Israeli-Palestinian problem. What I'm arguing is that settler colonialism is a sort of bad idea. It's a bad political idea. It's a bad lens through which to understand the history of the United States, but also the history of Israel. And it will lead only to more conflict, because as long as you say Israel is a settler colony, that means Israel should be fought until it disappears. And the way that you make peace is not by getting everything you want. It's not by saying Palestinians want Israel to disappear, and I think a lot of Israelis would be happy if Palestinians left. I don't see any way that either of those things happens that isn't a complete human and moral disaster. And so that leaves you with the only other option, which is to find a means of coexistence. And that is not a popular position right now, certainly not among Israelis and Arabs, and not really anywhere. It doesn't seem very plausible that it could happen. It's a lot easier to see bad things happening than good things happening. But I think that in the end, I don't see what other outcome there is that's worth hoping for and working towards. So maybe I'll stop there, and then Jonathan, maybe we could talk a little bit.
Thank you, Adam, for your really illuminating lecture and discussion of your book. We are kind of closing in on the time that was set aside for comments from the audience. And so I'd like just maybe to ask you one question,
Sure.
which is this problem of left and right in the world today. When I was growing up, the left and right had clearly differentiated meanings. Today, they seem to be at this extreme point when it comes to Israel. They seem to have fused almost in their objectives, and I wonder if you have some thoughts about that.
Well, I'm not sure if it's true about Israel. I think it may be more true about Jews in general.
That's yes.
I think that there are conservative or right-wing nationalist regimes, especially in Europe, that like Israel and like Netanyahu's Israel, because they see it as pursuing the same goals that they are, which is to sort of create a nation state for a people and to do that aggressively if necessary. But I think it's true that not just today, but probably always been true, it's certainly in modern Western politics, that the extreme right and the extreme left both hate Jews. And they come to that sort of by different paths. But it's always been true that like the extreme right in the 20th century saw Jews as racially not belonging in Europe and as an alien element that was only out for itself and hurt everyone else around it. And the extreme left saw Jews as the ultimate capitalists, the people who were responsible for capitalism and for the rule of money. And so anti-Semitism was always a sort of odd ideological zone where people on the right and the left met. And in fact, in the late 19th century, there was an expression, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools, meaning that the same things that a lot of socialists thought about capitalism, anti-Semites said the same thing, but they said Jewish capitalism. And in the 1930s, you had this terrible irony where Hitler said that all the Soviets were Jews, and that Bolshevism was a Jewish conspiracy, and the Soviets, particularly Stalin, hated Jews and saw them as capitalists and subversives and secret Zionists and wanted to get rid of them for that reason. So it's always been true that Jews, I think, because we are conspicuous and because we're a very small minority, we're an easy target, and we play all kinds of roles in the imagination of the wider society, which are often not to our benefit. And I think you can see that in the current debate as well.
All right. Well, there's a lot more I would like to ask, but our audience has raised many questions. Some of them perhaps you've seen. I'll start with a question from Jeremy Silverstein. I'm sorry, from Richard Hecht, to expand upon your remark about the Calvinism and settler colonialism.
Sure. Well, in talking about, in looking at some of the ways that settler colonial ideas are used, especially I think among young people, and especially not by academics in their formal academic writing, but people who have sort of adopted this way of looking at themselves. A lot of it has to do with confession. A lot of it has to do with saying, I am a settler. I acknowledge that I am a settler. That's what land acknowledgements are. They're sort of a confession of sin. And you see people write about this. You see people, write autobiographically about this. And to a certain extent, it's even become popular for people in these circles to identify themselves as settlers. Sometimes academics will identify themselves that way in their author ID. And sometimes people even do it on Twitter, especially I think in Canadian Twitter or Canadian X, as we now say. People will say settler in their little Twitter bio. And it struck me that that's very similar to the way that evangelical Christianity talks about being a sinner. That you don't want to be a sinner, but the first sign that you're on the way to grace is that you acknowledge that you're a sinner. And so in a similar way, people who think being a settler is a bad thing, the first step towards purging yourself of that or of enlightenment is to say, yes, I am a settler. I acknowledge it. I have this unjust privilege of living in this land where I shouldn't be. And it's up to me to sort of make atonement for it. That's what I was talking about when I talk about the idea of original sin and sort of the need to repent. And in a strange way, there's this sort of inverted moral prestige attached to it, right? So that the more vocal you are about being a sinner, the better of a person you are, because you understand how important this is, and most people don't. So by saying that you're worse than everyone, you become better than everyone. And I think that a lot of sort of left discourse, especially on this issue, and especially among young people, has that same dynamic.
Phil Schwartz has asked a question that I know is on the minds of many people, which is, on a sub-state level, aren't Jewish settlers in the West Bank engaging in settler colonialism?
Yes, that is an important point, and there's more to the whole question than I was able to get to in my sort of summary statement of the points. One point, which I say in the book and quote Rashid Khalidi, who's a Palestinian American historian, is that he wrote a book called 100 Years War on Palestine, in which the term settler colonialism appears in the subtitle. And he says that from the Palestinian point of view, the arrival of Zionists, of Jewish immigrants to Palestine, felt like, and was for them, like being colonized, because it meant a bunch of people were coming to their land and establishing their presence there. And the fact that the native people living there, didn't want them made no difference. And to that extent, it is similar to the way that the British settled in North America or the Spanish in South America. It was that people were coming from Europe, or initially from Europe, and saying, we're going to live here, and whether you like it or not, we're going to stay here. The question of whether it was a conquest, I think it's often described as a conquest. It was not a conquest until 1948. And a lot of the debate about Israel and Palestine always goes back sort of endlessly to 1948, which was the year that Israel was created, or declared its independence, and the year that Palestinians remember as the Nakba, the catastrophe, because in the Israeli War of Independence, about 750,000 Palestinians were either forced to leave or chose to leave their land and became refugees, and their descendants, many of them are still sort of permanent refugees. That was That was by the people fighting that war, the Israeli leadership fighting the war, including David Ben-Gurion, said, that is the only way we can survive this war and create this state, is to create borders that are better than the borders the UN wanted to assign them. The reason why the land was divided is because the UN voted, we're going to create a Jewish state in this part and a Palestinian state in this part, or an Arab state in this part. And the Jews said yes, and the Arabs said no, and launched a war. They invaded. And it was a sort of a war between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, and also invasions from surrounding Arab states. And in that war, Israel drove out a lot of Palestinian refugees. So that's one way in which it is like a colonial enterprise. The other way is that, as someone said, on the West Bank, you have a situation where Israel has basically two forms of government, one for Jews and one for Arabs, and that the Arabs have no political representation and very few legal rights, and their land can be taken from them under various pretexts, and that the government is clearly there for the sake of the Jews, not for the sake of the Arabs. On the West Bank, I think there's a better argument that you have a situation like the situation in a settler colony, where you have a small number of people who have come in and are sort of ruling over, taking privilege over a larger number of people who have no rights, no representation. What to do about that, how that situation gets solved, I think is the key problem, which I don't have a good solution for, and I don't think anyone has a good solution for. But I think it's important, especially in talking to Jewish audiences, I think it's important for us as Jews to recognize that certainly when Arabs and Palestinians look at this situation, that's what they see. And also when a lot of non-Jews who are not Arabs and Palestinians look at the situation, that's what they see. If you're a writer, an American writer, and you don't have any particular connection or knowledge of this region, and you go on a visit to the West Bank and tour the wall and the separate roads and the constant armed guards and the checkpoints, you say, this is a terrible situation for these people. They're living under occupation. This is bad. It has to end. I think that can't be and shouldn't be overlooked and denied. The really hard question, the question that complaining about it or criticizing it doesn't answer, is how do Jews and Arabs extricate themselves from that situation? And that's much more complicated.
Well, on the one hand, the argument about settler colonialism seems to me an existential argument. And the argument about the West Bank seems to me an argument about policy. That is to say, about how government implements or abandons certain policies and the moral elements of those policies, as opposed to the question of whether the state itself deserves to exist.
Right. And one thing I say in the book is that, talking about left and right meeting, in an ironic way, people who want to destroy Israel because it's a settler colonial state have the same idea as sort of religious extremists who want to occupy the West Bank, because both of them say there's no difference between Israel proper and occupied territories. So one side says Jews don't belong in any of them. The other side says Jews have an equal right to both of them. There's no reason to make a distinction. I think that I understand where both of those sides are coming from. The reason to make a distinction isn't sort of a sort of basic metaphysical distinction, like God promised this land and not that land, or this land is sort of inherently Jewish and this isn't. It's a practical reason. The practical reason is, if you don't make that distinction, if you don't say this was where Jews will live and this is where Arabs will live, then you have constant conflict and war. And the inability of Jews and Arabs to say that is sort of the basic reason why the conflict continues. And there's lots of argument, of course, about which side is more responsible, which side is the one that is preventing the resolution of the conflict. There was this moment in the 90s when it looked like it might be possible for that conflict to be resolved, and then neither side was able to make that happen.
So coming back to your distinction between Israel, the founding of Israel at least, and typical settler colonial states, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the effect on the indigenous population of typical settler colonial states is, as opposed to Israel, where there is a substantial Arab population that has their own culture and their language and schools and so on and so forth.
Well, I think that's an important question. It's an important point that gets to something that's crucial in the current political debate, which is the idea of genocide. The theory of settler colonialism, starting with Patrick Wolfe, was very much about the idea of genocide. Wolfe's idea was that British settlers in Australia had committed a genocide of Aboriginal Australians, and similarly, people say that in North America, European settlers committed a genocide of Native Americans. And you can argue about whether that is a useful or appropriate way to describe that history. Certainly, the history of American conquest of North America over 250 years is very different from the history of Nazi Germany. to call those things both genocides, I think, is more misleading than clarifying. But in the current discussion, people regularly say Israel is committing genocide or has committed genocide in Gaza, and also maybe even more than in Gaza. And I think that that is a sort of sleight of hand. It's a sort of verbal sleight of hand. If you define genocide as killing an entire group of people, attempting to exterminate an entire group of people, it's sort of very obvious that that is not what happened in Israel, and it's not what's happening in Israel. One way of measuring how obvious it is to say that since 1948, the Arab population of between the river and the sea, right, between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, the Arab population has gone from about 1.5 million to about 7.5 million. So far from being a genocide, it's been a period of explosive population growth. Even in the recent conflict in Gaza, where I think it's been reported that Israel loosened the rules of engagement to make it easier for soldiers to attack civilians, to kill civilians. In other words, they said you will be allowed to call in an airstrike or an artillery strike, even if a certain number of civilians is going to be killed. And where certainly thousands of people have been killed and there's been terrible suffering, to call that a genocide is very misleading, because it's not an attempt to exterminate people. It's not an attempt to make those people disappear. And there have been, I think, a lot of misinformation about this. One thing that struck me at the time and that stays with me is last fall, Israel twice interrupted combat operations in Gaza to allow the two-stage vaccination for polio for children. In other words, they allowed aid workers to come in and vaccinate 600,000, I think, Palestinian children. And then again, 3 weeks later, when you have to do the second stage of the vaccine, paused combat operations again. That's not a genocidal policy, sort of obviously. That's a policy that looks forward to those people continuing to live there. So I think that people like to describe this as genocide for obviously polemical reasons, for rhetorical reasons, because it makes Israel look very bad, and for reasons related to their history of the Holocaust, but also because it's part of the idea of settler colonialism, that settler colonialism means genocide.
Let me see here. Um, would you say, this is from Sonia Michael, would you say that that critiques of societies, governments, civilizations for being the result of settler colonialism and calling for a restoration of indigeneity are inherently ahistorical? Don't societies and environments always change over time? If so, where do we draw the line? What constitutes natural evolution? What illegitimate colonialism, conquest, etc.?
I think that's definitely true. And when theorists of settler colonialism use the term, they're almost always talking about those four countries that I've mentioned: Australia, the US, Canada, and Israel. That's where I'd say 90% of the attention is. There are other historians who have said, well, the way the Japanese settlement of Manchuria in the 1930s is settler colonialism. And you can even say that, the Greek city-states in the ancient world practiced settler colonialism. In a certain way, it's hard to draw any really clear line between settler colonialism and war and conquest, which is sort of the whole history of civilization is about war and conquest. And really, any country in the world, if you went back far enough, you would find that it's an example. It was created through conquest and settlement. The only question is, how far back are you looking, and which countries are you looking at? I think the reason why people are looking at Anglophone countries and Israel is for contemporary political reasons, because if you are a citizen of one of those countries, those are the countries you care about. You don't necessarily care about, Argentina or even, Iceland. Anywhere you look, there was European settlement or other kinds of settlement. You're only concerned about particular issues in countries. Interestingly, this is a debate going on right now in Greenland. We all know Greenland is in the news because the idea that the U.S. was going to buy it. Greenland is very much a situation where you have a native Inuit and Danish people who sort of rule over it, and it's a very small number of people there. I think like 50,000, but it's a lot of the same dynamics.
Let me see if I can find one last question here. There's so many. Let's see. This is from Erica Lehrer. Thanks for opening this conversation at YIVO. I want to push back a bit on your characterization of colonialism as being typically invoked as Calvinist original sin. In North American academic arts activist circles I'm familiar with, it's viewed as a structure of ongoing inequality, of which settlers are contemporary beneficiaries. To use Michael Rothenberg's term, what is typically called for then is not that settlers should leave the colony, but rather a process of redress and repair of the ongoing inequity, which may be theoretically true, but I'm not sure that's what people want for Israel.
No, in fact, I think that's completely right, but the two things are exactly go together. If you were saying that you want an end to settler colonialism, but you can't or don't want to get rid of the settlers, what you're saying is you want settlers to change the things about themselves that make them settlers. And that is a political process, and there's a political aspect to it about redistribution of wealth or about sovereignty and things like that. But I think that it's definitely true that for a lot of the people in this field and a lot of the people who write about it, it is a spiritual process. It means I am a settler and I have to change myself inwardly to change things about myself that are the legacy of settler colonialism. So I think that it's right to say that people don't say settlers should leave or decolonize in a concrete sense, but because they don't say that, they end up making decolonization mean something much more sort of abstract and difficult to get a grasp of. And in the book, I give a lot of interesting examples of this having to do with all kinds of things, but even things like building an astronomical observatory. There's this case about there's an attempt to build a space telescope in Hawaii, and it became this debate about, well, is science a colonial construct? Is the idea that you're looking back 14 billion years to collect light from the origin of the universe sort of an inherently colonial idea of the way time and space work? And that is definitely an example of how it's about changing who we are, how we think, not just politics.
Well, there's so much more to talk about. Maybe we will have a reprise of this conversation or continue the conversation in other ways in the future. But for now, Adam, I want to thank you very, very much for your brilliant book that I urge all of the people who have watched us to purchase for your courage in producing this book, which I know is not popular in many circles. And I want to thank all of our viewers for watching this program today.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for everyone for listening.